All right, I guess we can go ahead and get started. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining Columbia Riverkeeper today as we talk to Leah Thomas, founder of Intersectional Environmentalist and author of The Intersectional Environmentalist, How to Dismantle Systems of Oppression to Protect People and Planet. So my name is Simone Anter, she, her. I am Jicarilla Apache and Yaqui and a staff attorney at Columbia Riverkeeper, and have the pleasure of being our moderator today as we talk to Leah and hear more about her debut book, The Intersectional Environmentalist, which was published on March 8th, 2022. So while her first novel, Leah's writing has also appeared in a variety of publications, including Vogue, Elle, Marie Claire, and High Snobiety. And she has been featured in Harper's Bazaar, W Magazine, ABC News Live, Domino, Goop, and numerous podcasts. Leah is a celebrated environmentalist based in Santa Barbara, California, coining the term eco-communicator to describe her style of environmental activism. Leah uses her passion and creativity to explore and advocate for the critical yet often overlooked relationship between social justice and environmentalism. With this intersection in mind, Leah founded and launched Intersectional Environmentalist in 2020, a resource hub and platform that aims to advocate for environmental justice, provide educational resources surrounding intersectional environmentalism, and promote inclusivity, accessibility within environmental education and movements. Leah, who is also the founder of eco lifestyle blog Green Girl Leah, uses her multiple years of eco-focused educational and work experience to inform her ever-expanding list of projects, as well as her audience of more than 400,000 followers across channels. A graduate of Chapman University with a BS in environmental science and policy and a cluster in comparative world religions, Leah has interned twice with the National Park Service and has worked at leading green companies, including eco-friendly soap company Ecos and most recently Patagonia. A fundamental optimist and opportunity maker, Leah used her time after being furloughed during the pandemic to create Intersectional Environmentalist. So Leah, thank you so much for joining us today. Personally, as a graduate of UCLA's Law School's Critical Race Theory specialization, I was so excited when my coworker showed me your Instagram page in 2020, and even more excited when I began to follow your work connecting social justice and environmentalism through an intersectional lens. I'm really looking forward to hearing more about you, your work, and your book, which I think offers a wonderful primer for those looking to make their environmental work more just, more intersectional, and really just more in tune with the world and people. So for folks on the webinar, please make sure to send in your questions via the chat function, as we will have time for a Q&A. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Leah. Thank you so much for being here.
Hi, thank you so much for having me in that really lovely introduction. For everyone who's tuning in, I'm not sure if I can see it in the chat, but feel free to type, where you're tuning in from. I'd love to see that. But yeah, I guess just to start out with my background, like you explained, I studied environmental science and policy and am pretty much in love with all things environmentalism and have been from a really early age. But unfortunately, in a lot of environmental spaces that I was in, whether it was intentional or not, there wasn't really a lot of representation of people of color, whether we're talking about specifically the staff of many of these organizations or some of their missions. Environmental justice wasn't always kind of mandatory in a lot of environmental work. And that's something that I really struggled with over time. And I love to see, okay, so we've got a lot of people in Portland, Oregon. Shout out to Portland. Wow, so many places. That's awesome. So to get started, I'm just going to read you about 2 paragraphs from the introduction, because I think this is pretty much the thesis of the book. And the introduction is actually the only chapter that's in first person. The rest of it is kind of sort of a textbook for people who want to learn. So the introduction is extra special to me because in many ways it feels like it's almost a diary entry. So thank you all so much for letting me, share this with you. So does that sound good? Perfect. Okay, so we can't save the planet without uplifting the voices of its people, especially those most often unheard. And we should care about the protection of people as much as we care about the protection of our planet, because to me, these fights are the same. As a society, we often forget that humans are a part of our global ecosystem and that we don't exist separately from nature, we coexist with it each and every day. Unfortunately, as with other animals, some humans are endangered and facing a multitude of social and environmental injustices that impact their ability to not only survive, but also thrive in liberation and joy. Why then are conservation efforts not extended to the protection of endangered humans and their human rights? This is a question that I've struggled with as a Black environmentalist for years, because in my environmental practice, and I'm sure many of yours, caring for the earth means caring for its people. So that's kind of, I would say, the thesis that carries on throughout the book, just the importance of advocating for people in addition to advocating for the planet. And before I get into it too much, is this a Q&A between us, or do you want me to just keep going?
If you want to just go ahead and keep sharing, and if folks have questions, they can put them in the chat. Then we can ask you some questions too. So
Perfect. That sounds great. So caring for people and the planet sounds pretty simple, and a lot of environmentalists already naturally do that. And the environmental justice movement, which explored identity and income and how that kind of contributed to where toxic waste sites and facilities were placed, that's been around as a field of study since the 80s. But for me, I think something that was really difficult was environmental justice is often kind of siloed over here. And when I was studying environmental science and policy, it wasn't mandatory to learn about environmental justice history. So I didn't learn about the mother and father of environmental justice, people like Dr. Robert Bullard, who did a ton of research on where toxic waste sites are placed and what pollution levels look like in communities of color. I didn't learn about Hazel M. Johnson, the mother of environmental justice, an incredible Black woman based in Chicago that also was studying things like toxic waste sites and facilities and the negative health impacts I was having on low income and communities of color. And because it isn't mandatory to learn about the intersections of identity and environmentalism throughout a lot of environmental programs, we see several classes of environmentalists that are graduating with an understanding of environmentalism that people and even endangered people or the most marginalized people don't have to be included in the context of their environmental work. Because why would they think that if environmental justice is kind of considered an elective and not built into environmental curriculums? And I think this disconnect has led to some unequal enforcement of environmental policies. Because when I started studying the statistics and seeing things like African American communities in the United States, about 71% live in counties that are in violation of federal air quality standards. And we see really similar statistics for Indigenous communities, low-income communities, etc. When I was looking at the data about tree cover and the placement of trees, we're seeing a lot of communities of color and urban communities that are having a lack of tree cover, and that's leading to all sorts of respiratory illnesses and things like that. And I wish we didn't have to consider identity in the context of how environmental laws are enforced, but we have to when things like race, that's the number one indicator of where toxic waste sites and facilities are placed. So when I was an environmental science student, I was the only Black student in my class. And I was studying environmental science kind of when the Black Lives Matter movement began. And it hit really close to home for me because I'm from Florissant, Missouri. If anyone's from Missouri, let me know in the chat. But Florissant, Missouri is about 10 minutes away from Ferguson, Missouri. And when I declared my major as an environmental science student on summer break after my freshman year, I declared my major. And then a couple days later, there was unrest following the police officer involved shooting of Michael Brown. And I had never seen something like this transform my community for the first time. There were nights and nights and nights of protests and vigils. There's so many conversations about social justice. And then I had to go fly off to California. I felt like I was abandoning my community as they were healing and trying to understand what was happening. And I started taking my intro to environmental science and policy classes. And of course, it was really hard for me to focus during the aftermath of Ferguson. But I remember just thinking over and over how unfair it felt that I could just find solace in all the beauty, all the national parks in Southern California to really heal from this trauma of what was going on back home. And I started wondering, what if everyone had access to that? What if everyone was able to go find, the healing properties of nature? And I started examining a community like Ferguson. And again, maybe it doesn't make sense off the bat, but I kept wondering, how could this tragedy have been prevented? What if we have everyone's basic needs met? So that's how I started looking at things like air pollution and water quality in areas like Ferguson. And I started seeing that air pollution is elevated in communities like Ferguson. Water quality isn't as great as it could be. And then there's a lack of green spaces. So not a lot of parks, not a lot of tree cover, and people don't always have access to go off in these kind of wilderness places or parks to explore. So I started thinking, and I know, again, this is kind of a roundabout way to, in my mind, solve what was happening during the aftermath of Ferguson. But it really stuck on me that maybe if everyone had their environmental, human rights, as they should be considered, met, having access to clean air, access to breathe clean air, access to clean water, access to just be in nature, maybe there would be better outcomes and people would be joyful. So that stuck with me throughout my studies and many of my intro to environmental science and policy classes. Again, we weren't talking about people. I remember I had once went to a protest about endangered salmon, and I thought that it was so great. I was taking it to the street for the endangered salmon. But I started to also think, in addition to talking about these endangered salmon, can we also talk about if there are any fishermen that are impacted economically by the endangered salmon? Can we talk about the indigenous communities and how they might be impacted by the endangered salmon? How's the water quality? How is that trickling into people's water or agriculture runoff, etc.? And I felt like there was a really serious lack of including people at times in some of these environmental equations. And I think shortly after my protest for the salmon is when the Black Lives Matter movement kind of kicked off. And a lot of environmentalists were left asking questions. What is our responsibility when it comes to racial justice? And again, that completely makes sense because you can graduate from an environmental science degree, you can work at an environmental nonprofit, and many never really talk about racial justice advocacy in the context of their work. So it makes sense that a lot of environmentalists during the summer of 2020 felt stuck and were trying to figure out what their responsibility was to combat racism. So I would say, especially because so many environmental injustices are so closely linked to identity, whether that's because of structural racism, past redlining, city planning, etc. Because that correlation exists, we should be talking about racial justice within the context of environmentalism. And not just stopping there, we should also be talking about things like reproductive justice, gender justice, etc. And within intersectional environmentalism, it's really just the argument that we should be prioritizing these things because it's not separate from environmentalism, it's kind of infused throughout it. So I have been talking about that for a while. Many environmental justice advocates have been talking about it for a while. But during the summer of 2020, I was very surprised when I started officially talking about intersectional environmentalism, and hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world said, I want to make a commitment and not be an environmentalist that dismisses what's happening to the most marginalized people. Because even when we're talking about the climate crisis, those least responsible for it are bearing the brunt of it. So we need to amplify their voices and make sure that this doesn't continue to happen. So with that, again, I had never in my life had so many people trying to learn about environmental justice, and it gave me so much hope. And that's why I founded Intersectional Environmentalist as a platform and started working on this book at the same time, because I want people who are new to the world of the intersections of climate and culture, or identity and environmentalism, to have a really accessible guide to start their journey that's accessible and approachable and has data to back it up. So kind of just a lot of my work started as meeting the really cool demand of kind of a new wave of environmentalists that want to make sure that the most marginalized voices are uplifted and no longer left out of environmental movements and policies, because this oversight, as we spoke about earlier, has led to kind of an ineffective form of environmentalism that doesn't equally protect all people. And that's what I'm fighting for. So that was a little bit about the book and my backstory. And I know that I got through that much quicker than I would have hoped, but I'd love to take some time to open it up for Q&A and yeah, talk to you all a little bit.
Yeah, thank you so much, Leah. And I think your book really does that. It's very approachable, and you can just pick it up, read it, learn. There's data behind it, which I think will speak to a lot of environmentalists. And it's just a wonderful starter. I mean, I could see this being taught in school, in high schools, like should be taught in high schools, and definitely be taught as part of environmental studies majors. But we have a few questions, but I would like to start with one first. Where do you see this book going in the future? Do you want it to be in classrooms? Do you see this as the first of many books? Yeah.
Yeah, I see this book, and it's nice getting like reader feedback of different applications for it, because this is really a 101 level about intersectional environmentalism and environmental justice. So I could see this starting in high schools, potentially middle schools, but then I've also seen some colleges starting to use it. I think it would be a fun book for academic adoption, and I'm seeing it being used that way. Because most of it is kind of a bit of a textbook or a supplementary text that people could use. But then I want to say it's for any emerging environmental student. So not traditionally, you don't even have to be in a classroom, but if someone is just really new to the world of environmentalism and they want to dive in, I would hope they would read a book like this, because then they'll deeply understand why we need to have diversity and inclusion in this movement. And yeah, I feel like that would be really awesome. And then I've also had people that work in environmental nonprofits and organizations and spaces that are maybe not intersectional or rooted in justice, equity, and inclusion. So I've had a lot of people come up to me and just say, you know what, I really want to change the way that I do my work to make sure that I'm representing more people. And that's been really cool to see. So lots of people.
Lots of applications. All right, we got some questions that came in through the chat. So the first one are, what are some tools that advocates can use to help them approach an environmental issue in an intersectional way, besides your book?
I love that. I think the first part, which is also really exciting, and I want to bring it back to this. So part of my work is, yes, uncovering environmental injustice and hazards and who it's happening to, etc. But this work isn't just about trauma. It's also about the fun of uncovering diverse stories throughout environmental history, like the origins of the tree hugger movement and these awesome women in India. So environmentalists can like see themselves positively reflected in environmental history, which also encourages more people to develop strong relationships to the land. So I want to hold those two things, because I want to make sure people, as you're doing a deep dive into intersectional environmentalism, understand and research the environmental justice data, but also do the fun part too and find all of those unsung heroes so you can learn about all these different approaches to environmentalism. And some books that I feel have done that really well. One that I read, it's called Black Nature. It's an anthology of poems from over 100 years written by African Americans. And oftentimes African American poetry is seen as kind of like civil rights poetry or racial justice poetry. But the person who put this book together argues there's actually nature themes throughout so many of these things, even just stories about following the stars to freedom that could be reframed as a nature story or an environmental story, etc. So that book really challenged my brain. I would also say, and I know everyone loves this book, but Braiding Sweetgrass, such a good book, especially for environmental scientist types to understand why validating Indigenous wisdom is so important in the context of environmentalism, especially when Indigenous peoples worldwide protect over, what is it, like 80% of the world's biodiversity. So definitely should be incorporated in environmental studies and science. There's a new book I haven't had the chance to read yet that's similar. I think it's called Banana Leaves that I think is really good. And then if you're looking for online resources, and it's also a magazine, it's called Atmos, ATMOS, which is beautiful. And they have a lot more stories about climate and culture, but they're really heavy on editorial content. So yeah, I would check them out as well.
Awesome, thank you. And I'm sure there's even more resources too on Intersectional Environmentalist. So make sure to check that out, folks. Okay, so our next question, how do you stay excited, hopeful, and positive when facing climate disaster, environmental racism, and lack of action in terms of policy?
So how do I stay positive? That was the question. Oh yeah, I'm like, I'm trying.
Positive and hopeful.
Yeah, I would say lately. So there's a concept called radical imagination, and I'm reshifting my nonprofit's mission because initially we were all about dismantling structures that don't exist. And I saw this quote the other day. It's like, you know what you're dismantling and what you don't want, but do you know what you're building in the future that you do want? So I started thinking about that and how I could start practicing radical imagination to envision a much brighter future and have elements of those things in the present. So I've been exploring climate optimism as well and rooting myself in the solutions that are out there. Sometimes you have to look extra hard, but I also have a platform, Intersectional Environmentalist, that will show you a lot of those positive stories. So we just are rolling out a new podcast called The Joy Report. So while we will talk about environmental injustices, we'll also talk about the solutions that are available. And I think at this point in the climate movement, climate optimism and radical imagination is what we need, because I think the doom, at times it can be a motivating factor, but I think it can really lead to burnout really quickly. So rooting ourselves in the positive is what keeps me happy. So going out of my way to find solutions as well really helps.
Great. We have a lot of questions rolling in and I think I'm keeping up with them, but okay. So this individual, I work with K-12 teachers. What would you want students to learn about environmental justice in school, and how can teachers support youth in learning and taking action on justice issues?
Yeah, I think there are so many opportunities. Like I love speaking with K-12 education because I feel like they're so open to it and you can get really localized in your approach to this. So even if you're able to find some data online about like the air quality in your area, or I think ones that sometimes pair really well with people is like the presence of grocery stores. Are there more like fast food restaurants in our neighborhood than like healthy food? And you can start exploring things like food justice. I think these sorts of maps and data visualizations and getting as local as possible really helps. And then maybe something that's also really fun, if you're able to volunteer outside, is looking at, tree cover in an area. So you're talking about the importance of tree cover, kind of sprinkling in the concepts of environmental justice by saying, did you know, according to American Forests, that based on median income, tree coverage will shift. So you can show them these maps and things like that, look at your community, and then if you want them to, get hands-on, they can go plant some trees or do something with a really cool climate justice organization. So that's what I would say, make it as local as possible, and data visualizations really help with environmental justice as well.
Awesome. Okay, so how do you approach conversations with BIPOC folks who do not believe in the biosphere crisis or believe that the movements for civil rights and holistic justice are tied into a stuck mindset of victimization?
Yeah, I would say sometimes I am hesitant, especially if you're talking about a community that has experienced a lot of like injustice. It's really hard for me to come into that community and be like, by the way, did you know that your air quality is also terrible? So they're dealing with so many issues maybe in their community, and maybe honestly they're focusing on survival. When I was assessing like the Earth Day movement, for example, it wasn't very inclusive of working class people or people of color. And it's not because they didn't care, but it was just because they had to go to work. Like people, many of the people who are working class people, it is a bit of a privilege to be able to go protest regularly out in the streets. So sometimes when people are focused on survival, that's where their head is at. And especially if you come to them and talk about the climate crisis and say, this is a crisis that in large part your demographic of folks are not actually creating, and that it's mostly over 70%. We have corporations and the way we're doing agriculture to blame, but you should care, even though you're not causing it and you're being impacted the most. It's hard because then it gets back to survival. The reason they should care is because regardless of what they're doing, you know, let's make things better. I don't know. So it's just like, it's a hard way to convince people to care when they're focusing on survival. But I would say I usually try to start with empowerment again. So showing people what they're already doing. So for example, I used to go thrift shopping out of necessity. My family likes to reuse and repair things all the time. So when I go back to the Midwest and the South and I talk to my family, I talk to them about the cultural values that they already have. I talk about cost savings of different sustainable like fixes and things that they can do. And then little by little, after I've made some sort of cultural connection to why they should care, and it's not just this thing that's happening regardless of what they're doing, then people are often more inclined to care a little bit more. And then if you start sharing the statistics, like, asthma isn't just hereditary. Did you know that the air quality in our neighborhood is actually like terrible? Just little conversations like that bring it back to them and their community, I think really help.
Great. And then, okay, our next question, are there any transformative policy approaches or frameworks that you would want to uplift or that give you hope?
I would say there's a group called Generation Green, and they have a new framework called environmental liberation, which I don't want to paraphrase because it's amazing. But it's kind of like environmental justice, but it's talking about liberation a bit more. And they kind of frame it as like the next step to environmental justice is liberation for both people and the planet at the same time. So it's really cool. I really love it. And another thing that I think is really making a comeback in a major way because people need optimism is radical imagination. Like I was talking about earlier, not just rooting your work and the systems that you're trying to dismantle, but also rooting it in the possibilities of the future and how you can envision a more just society. So that gets me excited. I do feel like there's a bit of a wave of positivity that's happening and joy in a lot of environmental work, because I think the doom and gloom of the last couple of years, especially, people are just burning out. So I'm seeing people being more motivated by joy than doom. And I think that's kind of reshaping the ways that a lot of environmental organizations are also, crafting their missions and things like that.
Thank you for all these wonderful responses, by the way. I think with all these resources too, folks on the webinar, we have a lot of Googling and researching to do after this. So I really appreciate that. We have homework, which is glorious. So thank you. So another question we have are, what are some practical things that people can do every day to be an intersectional environmentalist if they have the privilege to do so?
I would say, I guess it kind of depends on where you're coming from. So if you are in any way connected to philanthropy. So when you look at environmental giving, I think it's less than 5% goes to BIPOC or people of color-led climate justice organizations. And the majority of the funding actually goes to like 12 large or 8 or 12 large environmental organizations, some of my favorites. But we're seeing a lot of funding inequity there. So if there's even a way to channel more resources to grassroots environmental justice groups, so they're not competing for resources, that's a really, really great way to be an intersectional environmentalist, is supporting the work that's already being done. And then if you can't donate, or if you're not in the philanthropy space, even amplification is just really important, even in passing conversation. It doesn't have to be something like super revolutionary or like an art exhibit or something like that. Even just in passing conversation, if you're saying, hey, I read this book, Braiding Sweetgrass, and I learned that you don't have to separate Indigenous knowledge from science. Like just starting these conversations with people around you, so important. Sometimes social media, you feel like sharing things, no one's going to see it, but you have no idea. I've seen people share stories or petitions, and I've clicked it and I've donated or read up about it. That's how I learned about radical imagination. And I didn't go back and tell that person that that sparked some sort of thought in me, but it did. So even amplification is a way to kind of be an intersectional environmentalist and reshape the narrative of environmentalism. So if you see like resources on disability justice and environmentalism, amplify that, whether it's, sharing it with your colleagues or people that you work with. If you see positive news stories as well, there was a story in California where there was beachfront properties that back in the day, it used to be a Black neighborhood, and then they were kind of chased out of town. Well, last year, the government of California gave the land back to the descendants. So that was really exciting to see, or instances of land back, etc. So sharing those sorts of stories, I think, makes a bigger difference than people realize. So talk to your friends, talk to your family. It doesn't have to be in a scary way, but start sharing and amplifying those messages.
Thank you. Okay, so our next question and comment. So I just started reading your book, and I really appreciate how you celebrate Black women and talk about how important it is to center Black women in the origins of intersectionality every time the word is used. Can you talk more about these origins?
Absolutely. And I think oftentimes, sometimes words become very polarizing, especially when they're frameworks that are created by women of color. I could speculate why that happens. But even the terminology identity politics, which gets us to intersectionality, I didn't know that it really wasn't as controversial or clickbaity as it is now. There's just this collective of really amazing, like, queer Black women who are saying, oh yeah, in order to have policies that lead to our liberation and rights, then it makes sense that our identity is infused in what policies we select, because our livelihood is at stake. And some people, their livelihoods aren't at stake when it comes to policy. So yeah, I don't know. It's really interesting to see how words are taken out of context to mean something that it's not. And I don't want to get into it too much, but intersectionality is critical race theory adjacent. And we're even seeing that now. People saying things like even teaching about Martin Luther King Jr. is somehow critical race theory. And it's just being used out of context. And with intersectional theory, I'm using it in context, but some people are using the word intersectional to just mean diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I wanted to give some backstory to its origins for people to hopefully use it in a way that honors the work of incredible Black women. And just for a quick example about the origins of intersectional theory, it started in the legal sense. There was a court case where a General Motors, they had fired all of the Black women in a certain department, but they still kept the Black men that were working there, and they still kept the white women that were working there. And there was a bit of a loophole in the law because the Black women united, all of them, Black and women, were fired. So they wanted to sue because they felt that this was a case of like a compounding factor of race and gender discrimination that led to their firing. However, when they went to court, their case was dismissed because the judge said, well, this isn't a civil rights issue because there are still Black men who are working there. And this isn't a women's rights issue or injustice because there's still white women. So you all were just fired just because you were fired. It has nothing to do because these two people are here. So Kimberly Crenshaw, the creator of intersectional theory, started examining similar cases where compounding factors were leading to specific outcomes, and that not considering those compounding factors led to a lot of injustices. So that's kind of the basis of intersectional theory, just making sure you're looking at compounding factors and how they influence an outcome. And you can find that within environmental justice, like sometimes race is compounded with income, and that leads to certain environmental injustices, or income alone is also a determinant of environmental injustice, but that could compound with something else. And not considering those overlapping identities doesn't always give the most comprehensive solutions. So that's a little bit about the origins of intersectional theory. It kind of builds off of the work of I'm going to say it wrong, but it's called the Columbia River Collective, which is a really cool radical group of feminists that created the term identity politics and also started talking about how people have interlocking identities, and that led to intersectional theory.
Great, thank you. To take, I think, 2 minutes and sum it up so perfectly like that was really great. Thank you. Okay, our next question that popped up is, justice requires honoring treaties made with tribal nations. How does that connect to environmental justice?
Yeah, I think this is incredibly important, and something that we're seeing in the environmental justice space is also like land back movements and things like that. Like, how does it look in the current system that we're in to give land back to Indigenous people? So we've seen that start to play out in different like local governments and things like that. Some people or some governments are starting to like sell land back to people, which is interesting because they shouldn't be selling it in the first place, but we're starting to see it become a bit more popular, like taking into account some of these like treaties and things like that. But yeah, I feel like I would have to get into this and get into the research a little bit more, but I do believe that it is connected with environmental justice, especially when we're talking about things like climate reparations and things like that, and also the land back movement. But I would check the land back movement out more because I feel like an answer could be there.
Great. And then it looks, I think we have one more question. So if folks have other questions, feel free to keep putting them in the chat. So this one is, what does environmental justice look like on the personal, city, state, and federal level?
I love that. It's broken up into a lot.
Also levels.
I love it, every level. So I'll start with federal because the Biden administration, I believe, is the first administration. Technically, the Clinton administration had some environmental justice like gatherings and things like that. But this is one of the first administrations to have an environmental justice council that actually has a really large budget and some authority and power. It's also intergenerational, which is really cool, with the father of environmental justice, etc. So I think that's exciting that there is a council that's advising this administration specifically on environmental justice. I also am excited because I think we need more representation of climate justice advocates within federal policy. So we see people like Michael S. Reagan, who is an incredible Black environmental justice advocate that is now, I believe, the head of the EPA. And there's a budget of about $50 million that's specifically going to different environmental justice causes. And I know that money isn't everything, but when we talk about the funding gap that I mentioned earlier, a lot of climate justice orgs know what to do. They just need funding. So that funding will be really helpful. At the state level, again, something that I'm really excited about is also like land back and those sorts of conversations that are happening at the state level. I also think that there needs to be things at the state level to address air pollution and water quality, because the fact that, yeah, there's so many Americans, even I think like 40% of white Americans are living in counties that are violating federal air quality standards. So even though that's a federal air quality standard, I kind of trust states to enforce that a little bit more, and I think they have the responsibility to do so. There's so many things that I could talk about, but I guess at the local level, I believe in the power of local governments more than sometimes other governments because it can get super hyper focused. So even just showing up at a city council meeting at times can lead to more trees in your neighborhood or a community garden, etc. So I really believe in the power of local governments to get more done for their community and work in partnership with grassroots environmental organizations. So that's just some food for thought.
Thank you. Okay, so we have some more questions. You're just sparking all the questions. This is great. Thank you, everyone who's putting your questions and comments in the chat. So how can native language dictionaries highlight environmental intersectionality in ways that demonstrate past, present, and future relationships across borders?
And also responding to a brief comment about the EPA. I think so. I have to double check, but the Environmental Justice Council specifically, I think, is advising the White House. So it might be a little bit different, but they are working with the EPA. But that does make me happy to hear that the EPA has had an Office of Environmental Justice since 1992. So this question, let me reread that. Do you mind rereading that again?
Yeah. So how can native language dictionaries highlight environmental intersectionality in ways that demonstrate past, present, and future relationships across borders? A very big question. It's a great one, though.
Yeah, this is a really great question. I feel like I'm going to have to ideate on that a little bit more. How can native language dictionaries highlight environmental intersectionality? I can speak to past, so native language dictionaries. I feel like I'm going to have to take some time to sit with that one a little bit. Yeah, I feel like I'll come back to that one because
that's fair.
Yeah, because it's like, I don't know, I think part of it is really starting in the past and uplifting all the contributions of people who have been doing environmental things, even though they may not have called themselves environmentalists. So I think it is really important to go back and talk about some of these unsung heroes and their contributions to environmental things. So even, for example, when we're talking about regenerative agriculture, I think it would be really important to say, regenerative agriculture builds off of these frameworks that Indigenous peoples have done when they care for the land. And then specifically giving credit, like if you can find a really incredible, Indigenous community that's doing specific practices, like give credit to them. And I feel like that's a way to incorporate intersectional environmentalism into the way that we talk about different environmental things. But I need to think about the present and the future relationship one, and then I'll circle back to that.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I think also looking at in native language dictionaries, looking at telling our stories in our languages and then framing them to today in these terminologies of intersectional environmentalism, because I think that a lot of the stories we tell as Native people have those elements to it. And I think just adapting the way that we connect them to the present day with these words and this vocab is super important too. But yeah, we can always circle back. And we have another question. So a friend started a group called Trail Posse that tries to get more people of color out into nature, visiting national parks, hiking, bird watching, etc. Can you discuss some of the barriers people of color face in getting out in nature and things we can do to eliminate them?
Yeah, I was just talking to someone about this because I used to work in the outdoor industry. So oftentimes they would have questions, even for marketing, of just like, we tend to hire our friends of friends to take photos of them testing out our gear, and our friends of friends aren't really diverse, and we're surfers, but we don't surf with a lot of Black surfers. And I was like, well, they're out there. But it is really important to understand cultural context as to why you might not see as many folks of color in specific spaces. I believe that the statistic is like over 50% of African Americans don't know how to swim. And that's something that's passed on generationally. So even just talking about kind of the trauma of the slave trade and water there, or talking about segregation and how many pools didn't even, allow Black folks to come. And it was kind of a safety concern. So many families just made the decision that, we stay away from water. So there's cultural context there. And that's why it is really important to support groups that understand that cultural context and are trying to, make a reconnection. So there's groups like Textured Waves or Ebony Beach Club or Tank Proof that's teaching people to go out in the water and learn how to swim safely. So I think that's a really important thing for people to understand, because there is a real fear as well. I know another organization called Brave Trails that specifically focuses on getting queer folks out into nature in groups, because sometimes the outdoors hasn't always been a safe space for openly queer people who might face violence. And the same is true for a lot of BIPOC people as well. I'm from the Midwest and the South, and I've heard so many iterations of, we don't go off into the forest. We're kind of scared that we won't come back because there's a really strong history of violence. So that's why it's important to support groups like Outdoor Afro and Brave Trails, Latino Outdoors, because they're trying to empower people to go out in groups so they can know that they belong in these spaces. So that's, a really big barrier, kind of the fear. And a lot of that is rooted in like decades and decades of, history.
Great, thank you. I'm not seeing any more questions coming through yet. So I just, are there any last thoughts or things, or even a paragraph from your book that you'd like to leave us with, or even maybe what's next for you? I know this is just the start of your work and your journey, and we'd love to hear where you're going.
I think one thing is just, just you never have to silence parts of your identity or have them take a back seat in order to advance a cause. So whether we're talking about race or income, spirituality, whatever it might be, we all can be a part of the environmental movement. I'm not religious, but I've been speaking at churches. It's something that I've done. And if the logic for some people is that they believe that the earth is one of God's creations and therefore they want to become a climate justice church, I'm there to meet them where they're at and kind of talk them through it. And I think that's something that we're missing in the environmental movement, having that compassion, understanding nuance for different communities. And I think we need to be able to understand that and start asking more questions and being a little bit more understanding, because that way we can build a more diverse and larger environmental movement that's able to get even more done. So that's just what I wanted to leave people with. And I really appreciate everyone coming, and I hope that you check out the book. My organization, Intersectional Environmentalist, is also on Instagram and online. We just launched a new website. I really appreciate you all taking your time to share this digital space with me.
Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining us and making us a stop on your book tour. And I'm so excited to see all the places you've been going and talking about your book. And yes, I highly recommend following Leah and her social media platforms. They are wonderful resource hubs, and just follow them. Yes, make sure to read the book too. And for folks who haven't gotten a copy, make sure to order from your local independent bookstore. For all the folks joining us in Portland, check out Third Eye Books, a Black woman-owned independent bookstore who we have been partnering with to get this book out there. So Thank you again for joining us. And yeah, check out some of our other webinars on Columbia Riverkeeper's Love Your Columbia webinar series.